Hello and welcome to you all. This is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the first episode of a show called The Roundtable, where we're just going to be discussing things that are happening in current events. And hopefully you all who are going to be listening to this will get some new information and new perspectives on current events. I'm joined by these three esteemed gentlemen, Larry Johnson, Andrei Martyanov, and Alexander Mercouris. And I think that all of you guys know them. And without further ado, I'm just going to throw the floor open and ask you, gentlemen, when do you think that Zelensky will be able to capture Moscow and be seated at the Kremlin? Do you think that it'll be at the head of this million-man army next week or the subsequent week? Because the way things are going, Alexander, what do you think?
Well, I think that this million-man army has melted away like the frost in spring, if I could say so. Mr. Reznikov, who is Ukraine's defense minister, has now come along and said, well, he was completely misunderstood. He gave an interview to the London Times. He talked about the million-man army. He doesn't speak English very well. It wasn't what he intended to say. The impression that was conveyed was wrong. Of course, he let it continue. We left this impression to continue for days and days, and we were all talking with bated breath about this million-man army. It's fiction. The whole thing is fiction. And I have to say this. We have people here. We have, people with intelligence, military background. We have people who are political leaders who are involved in this war. But Ukraine, it's quite remarkable because what they seem to do from day to day is they come up with these extraordinary media stories. The million-man army being, of course, one of them. And I am not someone, as I've said many times, who has a military background or who has an intelligence background, or all of those things. But I have been involved in logistics. And I can say that this idea of a million-man army is a logistic impossibility for a country like Ukraine. It cannot happen. It is an absurd story. It is bizarre that it was ever taken seriously.
Larry, do you want to pile on that? Because excellent.
I was going to suggest that Zelensky's dreams of being in Moscow will probably be realized tonight or tomorrow night. And it will be only in his dreams. It will be some sort of fantastical sleep-induced situation. When you look back in history, go back to the start of the Operation Barbarossa in Ukraine and Russia, and how many Soviet troops were lost. So at that point, they still the Soviets could withdraw to a position, still had more people to recruit. Their factories, they moved to the east of the Ural Mountains, they rebuilt. So there was always a hope that they would come back. When you look at Ukraine, where would they draw these million men from? I mean, right now, the police are chasing people around. It's reminiscent of someone trying to catch a chicken in a chicken coop. The chickens are scattering and running every direction, and these people are running in every direction, and the police are trying to grab them. It doesn't exactly convey a group of people who are convinced in the righteousness of their cause and who are dedicated patriots to wanting to line up to defend Ukraine. And even if they could, once they're enrolled in the army, where are they going to train that they're not going to be touched by a Russian missile? There literally is no place left in Ukraine that they can gather in force and be safe. And that sort of interferes with the training protocol if you're waking up every morning wondering if you're going to be blown to bits. So this joins the list of the Ghost of Kiev and Fat General Pavel, the watermelon with feet that was paraded as Putin scraping the bottom of the barrel.
Oh yeah, that was so despicable. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, is a picture of this gentleman in a like fatigues and a cap, and he was enormously fat, and he was identified as a Russian general, and that he was being mocked as being the bottom of the barrel. And some I believe it was Dutch journalists who looked into it and discovered that this gentleman was a retired border guard, and he was at some very innocuous function. I think it was a year or two ago, where he was there with his family. He was obviously, at one point there was a picture of him holding up his a small child that looked obviously to be his granddaughter. He was this innocuous fellow, but the media in the West trumped it up as some sort of oh, let's mock the Russians. It must be, Andrei, infuriating to have this kind of bullshit all the time in the Western media, isn't it?
Well, at this stage, actually, to be frank, I got simply tired to, responding to all kinds of fakes like that, because you cannot do much with this in terms of really influencing public opinion, because public opinion wants to be deceived. I mean, if we look at the mass of people, but obviously you have some circle of followers and people who want to think, and they join and read, Duran, and, they read Larry, they read my blog. And this is mostly to give them the introspective, so to speak, of what is going on. So, but you know what? I stopped being furious a little bit, some time ago. And I will be, though, tomorrow probably making videos specifically about some YouTube channel which pretends to be a military channel, those armchair strategists. And by the way, Alexander, I want to tell you one thing. Yeah, you're absolutely correct when you say about logistics. You know why? Because you know this expression. Why amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. Your military analysis, head and shoulder above all this 99.9% of those, amateurs and, BSers who basically hyping on the YouTube and monetize whatever the hell they can sell to basically oblivious public. And so you don't have to say, because you achieved a very great deal of the introspective, in this. And I totally agree with you. Having worked with logistics, that will give you some basically clue about what is going on. So, yeah, it's infuriating, but I learned to control it, so to speak.
Yeah, because in my own case, let me see, I think it was in May that I started hearing these rumors that in August there was going to be this big offensive. And I asked the obvious question, where is this, where are the soldiers that are being trained for this big August offensive? I don't see them anywhere. And of course, it was just a figment of the imagination. And so much of it is the figment of the imagination. And one of the things that just prior to the start of this program, we were laughing with Larry and Andrei about this gentleman called James Vasquez, who's become a bit of a bête noire for me, because when his videos started appearing on Twitter back in February and March, I saw them. And as you may know, I have a background in film production. And so I can spot a film set. Because there are always these telltale signs that make it look a little bit, quote unquote, hyper real, as opposed to actual footage of a real battle zone, which looks oddly different and flatter and more boring, quite frankly. And so because of that, I looked at the James Vasquez videos and said, these aren't right. And I quickly brought together several different videos that were all shot in the same location, and they were all being identified as Ukrainian soldiers who had destroyed Russian tanks, when in fact, when you look closely, you realize they were Ukrainian tanks that had been destroyed, and they were being used as the set for James Vasquez and other Ukrainian soldiers who were, pretending that they had just destroyed these tanks. And then there were propaganda films with other people in other languages. There was one in Ukrainian. There was another in Russian for the Belarusian market. It was all staged and market tested. And I'm bringing up the James Vasquez story because, Larry, something happened. And I'd ask you to please fill in our audience about it.
Well, there was a video posted of him on a New York subway. And I think this was taken about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. With a smaller African American man, and they're doing the typical jawing that goes on when you're about to get into a drunken brawl, and you know, each questioning each other's mother's sexual history, and and in the process of that, you know, going to also describing how they're going to surgically rearrange different parts of each other's anatomy once they got outside the train. And I mean, it was just, it was absurd. And so they keep jawing at each other, and then they step off the train. And when you look at Vasquez, he's all kitted out. You know, he's got what I call the ninja, he's wearing the ninja gear. And you're correct to note that the acting part of this, because you can dress up an actor to look like a ninja, you can get them to posture and talk like it. But then once the director yelled action and they actually squared off the fight, it was like watching something from the early 1900s where two gentlemen are squared up with their fists out, they're dancing around and they're jumping up, and it's like nobody's actually ever been into a real fight. If you've been in a real fight, it's usually over in about 15 seconds. In particular, the person that's you know, doing most of the damage knows what they're doing. You know where to hit. You put someone down quick. I mean, these guys, if a windmill in a hurricane is an accurate description. They're just, you know, hands flying all over and going back and forth and stumbling around. There was one very dignified black woman in this. I wish someone had got her name, because she was the only sane person in that crowd. She was trying to stop it.
Yeah.
And Vasquez, this little black guy, grabs Vasquez and throws him forward, and you know, then you get the plumber butt crack shot of him. So you know, his coat comes up, and it's a complete fiasco. And it's like, this guy, I mean, he had zero training in self-defense, zero training.
And that's absolutely right. But look, I just want to clarify that we're not mocking this man just for being a fool. What we're mocking him is because he was part of a propaganda campaign in Ukraine, and now he is part of a political situation in Washington that I wasn't aware of. Andrei, you wrote about it. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, it is downright scary when you have those specimens like this Vasquez dude. And he was testifying in front of the Helsinki Commission. I mean, I'm not going to be describing what this Helsinki Commission is. It's a purely propaganda outlet, you know, in the U.S. Congress. But the point is that this guy, he is obviously fake, you know, through and through. He offered his expertise, quote unquote, to the members of Congress. And then, of course, he stated the only thing correct which he stated was that, the fight is going to get even harder, obviously meaning the Ukrainian side. That's the one he got right. The rest of it, why the U.S. Congress continues to allow this basically fake people. And again, you have to remember, in 2014, during the Crimea return and the start of the civil war in Donbass, actually, with the Ukrainian forces attacking, as usual, peaceful population, Senator Inhofe was visited by the delegation of at that time, you know, the seat, so to speak, of the nationalist and Nazi people, headed by this very bizarre and mentally unstable person, Mr. Semenchenko. And he was presented with the photographs of Russian armored columns entering Ukraine. Well, guess what? In about a week, after somebody did their due diligence in Inhofe's office, it turned out to be that he was presented with the photographs of Russian 58th Army in 2008 fighting in North Ossetia. But he bought it, you know, he swallowed it, you know, line, hook, and sinker. And after it was disclosed that he was presented with the fake everything, he said, it doesn't matter. It's still, you know, Russian army is still there.
Well, what bothers me about the James Vasquez situation is that this actor, this fool, is testifying and potentially guiding or help guide American foreign policy, which I think is a disaster.
Well,
Alexander,
this is exactly the point, because you asked Andrei right at the start of the program, do you get angry about the things that are said? The people who should be angry is us, people in the West. We should be angry because, of course, what we're being told is absolute nonsense. And the people who are telling us these things are charlatans. Now, you know, I have to say, one of the best things about Larry's blog is that he exposes that, you know, day after day, week after week. So does Andrei, actually. But I mean, we really should be angry. We should be angry, first of all, obviously, with these people who peddle these stories. But we should also be angry with our leaders and our media who reproduce them and who swallow them, because you cannot make policy decisions based on fiction. I mean, this is not how you conduct policy, especially when the stakes are so high, and they are becoming very, very high indeed. We have a military debacle, happening now in Ukraine, and that will have political consequences. It will certainly have big political consequences in Europe. That's the first thing, and of course, in Europe especially, we have a massive economic debacle on our hands, and we need real information. People need to be told what is true, and we need our leaders, such as they are, to actually start being straight with us. Not, coming along and saying, well, he is the 58th Army in South Ossetia in 2008, but that doesn't really matter because it might just as well be the Russian army in Donbass. That is not acceptable in a functioning political system, especially in a conflict like this.
Of course, the incompetence of this covert action effort. And I was fortunate when I was at the CIA. I started in 1985. Within the first 6 months I was there, I did an 8-week internship on the Afghan task force. So this was running the support for the Mujahideen to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And working on the covert action, I saw firsthand how both media, electronic TV, films, and written words were being used to insert into the debate. Then I did a stint on the Central America Task Force, which was the other major effort of U.S. foreign policy in Central America. So I saw it firsthand, front up. What is so embarrassing, candidly, about what's going on in Ukraine with respect to their covert action program, that's all they got. All they have, these past programs were designed to support some things that were actually tangible that were going on, such as when the Mujahideen were trained with Stingers and they started shooting down Soviet helicopters. It really created a problem for the Soviets back then in Afghanistan. So there was actual things taking place in the field. In Ukraine, this is what we get are these constant stories and wild claims, and former generals coming out and making, insisting that the Russians are down to their last bullet and they're going to die any minute. And then we continue to watch the steady march of the Russians across Ukraine, and we have yet in 5 months to see one single instance where Ukraine has taken territory and held it. And in taking territory, removed a Russian presence and held it in such a way that the Russians couldn't get back in. We haven't seen that at all. So all of a sudden, we're to believe that this magical mystery army of Ukraine is going to rise up like something, like the orc army out of the Lord of the Rings, and suddenly go marching on Moscow. I mean, it is so ridiculous. It's embarrassing that they've really shrunk to this level of incompetence.
Well, it has to be stated, and again, one of the so to speak main focuses foci, if you wish, focus of what I've been doing for the last many years was to warn that people have to understand, in Washington specifically, and of course in the West, and my books are about it, that even at at the time of 2012, 2013, it was clear that, and I hate those cliches, like, oh, the bear in the cave and things like that, but they didn't know what they were dealing with. I mean, and they didn't know that across the board, from policymakers, obviously. And since then, we have what? Almost 10 years passed. And guess what? The competence level, or rather incompetence level, of the US policymakers in Washington, D.C., be that legislature or including even military and intel institutions, I mean, it didn't increase. I mean, their incompetence is just like this insidious, or poisonous liquid, penetrating every cell. And they don't understand what they're dealing with, because obviously my main concern is to prevent any possibility of the war. And the war may start with some idiot thinking who bought, which I will be making video today or tomorrow precisely about it, or bought some PR stunt and says, oh no, we're great. We kicked, Saddam's army ass, in 1991 or 2003. Let's, kick them. They get in, and then they begin to experience what Ukrainian army experiences now in Russia. And I have to underscore that. And that's what many people do not understand. They still lack the grasp of it. If you look at the forces which Russia uses there, the bulk of those forces, apart from the what we'll call high-tech, standoff weapons, air defense and air force and things like that, the infantry, the bulk of those forces are primarily Rosguardia, Russian Guard, which is essentially internal troops, and of course militias of LDNR who have their own, so to speak, mobilizational base in the LDNR republics, and volunteers. And most of Russian forces, they stay back. They didn't even get into the fight yet. That's what they don't understand. And even there, and there is another question, obviously. Yeah, it's unheard of operation, because in terms of the West and its proxy, VSU, Ukrainian forces, which as they existed on the February 24, the start of the special military operation, and Kiev regime, these are the best proxies combined West ever had. They are head and shoulder above anything. Obviously, we're not going to be talking about this funny Afghanistan security force, which basically dissipated within 48 hours. Nor we're going to be talking about Iraqi security force or what have you. They are nowhere near. We have actually direct command and control on many aspects of the Ukrainian operations by Pentagon and United Kingdom Defense Ministry, and of course MI6 and things of this nature. And here they are. I mean, Russians didn't even come in force yet, clearly.
Yeah, because as I understand it, the NATO was basically training, as I understand it, between 10 and 12,000 Ukrainian troops per year, starting in 2015, I believe. So basically, they had 6 full years of, they must have trained at least 60,000 to 70,000 Ukrainian troops. So it was the best NATO army that was fielded in Europe, and it's getting chewed and taken apart. Yeah, Alexander?
Well, what I wanted to say also is that, the other thing is that there's clearly been a complete collapse in the quality of our intelligence operations in the West. And that's something which I think Larry can talk about. But clearly, Western governments are completely ill-informed about, firstly, the nature of the Russian military system and how it operates. And can I just say, this is logistically an incredibly impressive operation that we are seeing. That's one thing I will say right away. But the second is, there's been a complete misunderstanding of the way the Russian economy functions and how Russian society works. And this is something I have been actually talking about for years. The reason is I've been to Russia several times, not hugely often, but I've been around the country. I've been to the Urals, I've been to Moscow, I've been to St. Petersburg, I've been to other places. And it became immediately clear to me that over the period of time since the 1990s, not only was the country pulling itself together, but that it has layers of administrative managerial, and engineering competencies, which the Western governments simply didn't acknowledge or recognize. And of course, we have, beyond the failure in terms of military understanding of this war, we have the even greater failure, at least I think it's an even greater failure, about the economics. I mean, the West launched a sanctions war against an adversary it didn't understand. Now, I can remember the Cold War. I can remember, the CIA of the 1980s, the 1970s. And it used to produce reports about the Soviet Union, which you took seriously and which did correspond to realities. I mean, because in those days, clearly, there were good analysts. There were people who looked at Soviet information. They plowed through all the statistics. They plowed through all the media. They did all the hard work. I don't get the impression that happens anymore.
Well, what I've noticed is that the current Western leadership across the board, in government, in media, in the military, in private industry, it's beyond that they're incompetent. They are like spoiled children. They are trust fund babies. They have been acting as if they have limitless resources at their disposal. And so they act in very stupid ways, many times driven by fashion, intellectual fashion, ideology, often driven by what the other guy is saying or doing or thinking. Rather than being pragmatic, they are looking internally. It's very navel gazing kind of thing. And I think the problem that we are having is that all of a sudden we're realizing that Western prosperity is coming to an end. I can speak not with great authority, but with a great deal of knowledge about the Western economic situation. It's catastrophic. It's been this way since the 2008 global financial crisis, which I watched very, very carefully and had a blog about it. And I was managing money at the time, enough that I was very, very concerned and frightened for the future stability of the financial system. And I see that none of the problems in 2008 were fixed. At the time, it was obvious that they weren't being fixed, and they were kicking the problems down the road. And well, finally, we're coming to a point where the problems can no longer be kicked. And so we are seeing this, the energy problem, the gas problem, the basically natural resources from Russia problem, but it's coalescing with the overall over-indebtedness problem, the money printing problem that started because of COVID and before, the various iterations of QE. It's snowballing. It's basically rich kids who are all of a sudden realizing that their trust fund is going on empty. Larry, what do you think of this metaphor?
Well, it is. I wanted to go back and touch first on what Alex raised about the intelligence community. It has become more bureaucratized and politicized. So the political pressure has always been there. I was fortunate when I was a new analyst to go through the new analyst course with a fellow named George Allen. There was a George Allen who was the football coach of the Washington Redskins. This was not that George Allen. This was the George Allen who was in charge of Vietnam's analytical directorate at the CIA during the height of the Vietnam War, during the Tet Offensive in 1968. And he described to us how he had faced enormous pressure. I mean, he said he was getting phone calls from Lyndon Baines Johnson, then the President of the United States, McGeorge Bundy, who is the national security advisor at the National Security Council, McNamara, Robert McNamara at the Department of Defense. They're all calling this one analyst, but he's a senior manager, and saying, hey, why aren't you being a team player? So this notion of politics trying to influence intelligence, it's nothing new. It's been around for a while. And I was glad that he taught us that, because I faced some of the same pressures when we were doing the Nicaraguan analysis and with respect to what was happening with the Contras and what was happening with the guerrilla war in Salvador. Jump ahead to what's going on now. my understanding is that you have lost that cadre of analysts who were willing to push back and resist the pressure from up the line, because it's now all about getting promoted. One of my good friends, who I think may be watching this broadcast, he's a retired CIA logistics officer. He always maintained CIA would be better off in hiring personnel if they just drove a bus aimlessly around Northern Virginia and picked people up randomly, brought them on board and said, "Hey, you're gonna join the CIA," as opposed to this, mythical the testing and the kind of clearance process they go through. So losing an analytical foundation that can push back, and that goes into your question, Gonzalo, about the economic side of it. Because, I mean, for God's sake, why nobody even anticipated, apparently they did not anticipate the even remote possibility that, hey, Russia might be able to be self-sufficient economically, and therefore all of our sanctions won't work. And oh, by the way, we don't yet have one historical example where sanctions have worked to alter the political course in a country. Cuba being case in point.
Yeah, and going back to what Larry stated and what Alexander stated also about this miscalculation, which actually my first book was about it, that, you know what, guys, just learn the goddamn facts first before you talk about. But there is one interesting thing which really puts Russia apart, and it's not a secret. It's been actually talked about and even shown. That all Russian top administrators or managers on the level of the oblast, or the district, governors basically, and vice governors, deputy governors, and people of this nature, to understand what is going on for years, they, before or during their tenure as the heads of the, administrations of those, jurisdictions, Russia's main jurisdictions, which are oblast, they've been taking courses in the Academy of the General Staff. You have literally those people, many of them who, simply civilians, you grab them, you get them, depending on the importance of the district and its place in the overall economic and military economic structure of Russian Federation, and you get them either through 2-3 weeks courses, or you get them for freaking full course in the Academy of the General Staff. And they go there and they study what economically and militarily war means for Russia, depending on the different scenarios. And this is serious science, and you will not find it, for example, in, you get what? U.S. Congress Research Service, which sometimes does a good job, but it's mostly literally explaining to people who have no clue. And you have to explain to them some military realities and tactical and operational ones, which are complex. They require a lot of experience, observation. They have this, couple of hours briefing. And that is why General Latif, Major General Latif, PhD in physics, 20 years in DARPA, he wrote absolutely clearly in his book, The Future War, everything that U.S. legislature and U.S. political elite and public know about the war is primarily from entertainment. And
from Saving Private Ryan.
Or Top Gun.
Or Top Gun, worse, fantasy. So
I love Top Gun 1. Great soundtrack.
Let's look at the reality now, because here we're coming up. The eastern front around Lysychansk, it collapsed. The Russians advanced. They're hitting Bakhmut, and the name of the town to the north slips my mind. It's the one that they're
Seversky. Yeah.
And it seems as if that's becoming not much more than a speed bump for the Russian army. And the next big line is, of course, Kramatorsk.
Yeah.
You gentlemen, the three of you have been following this very carefully. And so I'd like your appreciation as to what you think is going to happen in the relative short term, and where do you think the Russian army is going to move next? If you don't mind, I'll start with Alexander. I'm inviting you to speculate, but it's informed speculation because, quite frankly, I think that we can all agree that the intelligence services of the West are a complete disaster. And so you three gentlemen, between the three of you probably do a better job of analysis than the entirety of Langley, Virginia. So that's why I'm going to hit you up for what your thoughts are as to the coming chapters in this conflict.
You start with the least qualified of the three,
Oh,
but I'm going to give an unequivocal view. Siversk, I think that's pretty much done. Actually, I mean, the Russians are doing it in their own way, as they always do. I think that the pattern, as far as I can see, is this, and it is very much an industrial, it's a logistics pattern. You move your artillery, your people close to the line where you have to break through. Now that isn't straightforward, because if you have lots and lots of guns, you've got to keep the ammunition running. You've got to get your supply lines organized. You've got your ammunition depots. You've got to bring all the machinery coming through, and that takes time. That's a big organizational feat. And so they do that. They come up to the next fortified line. They bring their artillery, they bring their military people, they soften up the infantry formations, the Ukrainian infantry formations or other formations that are nearby. They incrementally take the settlements. They then close in on the town that they're about to capture, and then they move on to the next. Now, that's already happened essentially with Siversk. And it seems to me that this defense line that Ukraine very hurriedly put together before you get to the real battle of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, what's been touted as the real battle of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, that is now close to collapse. That's how it seems to me. So this line of defense is going to collapse, and then we're going to see the whole thing repeat itself with Slavyansk-Kramatorsk. And that's going to be the last part of the Battle of Donbass. And I think we are now at the end game of the Battle of Donbass. What happens after in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, that's another issue. But that's where we are at the moment. And I think the thing to say about Siversk also is consider what the Ukrainians were saying about it just a short time ago. I'm not able to access these things directly, but from what I was reading, they were pushing, they were saying they're going to put 20,000 people to defend Siversk. That Siversk was this incredibly important place. Now, of course, they're saying that they're pulling their people away, that it's not that important. They always say this about whichever place is about to fall. And it is about to fall. And as I said, it is, I suspect, important. But it's important because the defense line is cracking.
Larry, what's your thinking?
Well, as I've been following this, and I'm much smarter now than I was 4 months ago, finally understanding how entrenched the Ukrainian forces were. But with those entrenchments, those troops that were dug in were supported by artillery. They were supported by armored, by tanks. And so against an attacking force really faced a significant obstacle. And yet the Russian strategy has become, I'm not sure at what point that finally fully clicked in, but their strategy and tactic of taking out the command centers and destroying the artillery and the tank columns and the fixed wing aircraft and the rotary wing aircraft, basically taking apart the physical elements that support that army, that you're going to, as you continue to chip away at that, the Ukrainians are not being resupplied in a fashion that allows them to replace those losses. And those losses continue to pile up. And then all of a sudden, you've got these troops entrenched. They've got no support from artillery, no support from armor. And then they're being constantly bombarded both by artillery shells, by rockets fired by fixed-wing aircraft and by precision missiles. And it's not like it's just a 5 or 10 minute ordeal. It can go on for hours. And I don't care who you are, every human being will crack under that at some point. And so the Russians have perfected the art of that. At the same time, what the briefings we get from the Minister of Defense are informative but deliberately opaque. And what I mean by being deliberately opaque, he's not revealing what the Russian plans are. And I guarantee you the Russians are engaged with some deception operations where they're putting forces into a position that they know Western intelligence is going to collect on, to try to get Western intelligence to focus on that, and in terms of testing that to see which way the forces will move. At the same time, I am certain that the Russians have excellent human intelligence operations going on behind Ukrainian lines, where they're able to identify where troops are being assembled, where foreigners are coming, where missiles, ammunition depots are. So when you put all of that together, this is like a tsunami wave rolling in on Ukraine. They're a dead man walking. They may not realize it yet, but it is a dead man walking.
Yeah, like the human intelligence that you mentioned, I'm convinced that the strike that happened yesterday at Vinnytsia, where they killed the command of the Ukraine Air Force, as well as apparently foreign suppliers, to the tune, Andrei, correct me if I'm wrong, did they say something like 400 men were killed in that one strike?
Yeah, I heard also, something like on the hundreds, But you have to also keep in mind that even this morning news, first, Sergei Shoigu suddenly appears in Donbass. And guess what? He discusses with Denis Pushilin and other people, and he discusses what especially a lot of Western pundits wanted to point out, and of course Ukrainians themselves wanted to point out, the Donetsk is still being bombarded. Well, Sergei Shoigu today, and he never does anything spontaneously.
No.
Says, we are here to stop once and for all this shelling and missile strikes at Donetsk. And then suddenly, not anecdotal, but reports are beginning to pour in that Russian army begins to pull to the front line, which is obviously going to be the dash after that to absolutely, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the equipment which haven't been seen much as of lately, not as of lately, from the start of the operation, because it's primarily the armor which was used. It was the armor which was armor of the Eldanair and those attached armor units to the Rosguard. Now we suddenly have those T-90s, Prorivs, and Terminators vehicles rolling in mass. And that tells you something, that somebody from the really serious people begin to prepare to, obviously, what Alex correctly and Larry states, to finish off the Battle of Donbass, so to speak, which will be the fall of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And let's not forget this ever-present constant of this operation. VSU and people who command them, both in the West and from Kiev. The main tactics for them is and will remain for a while using civilians as the human shield. They do everything they can, because everything to provide the picture, so to speak, to the corrupt and absolutely amoral, 90% of them anyway, Western media, to show all those, horrible Ruskies, inhuman Ruskies, all those, Slavic Untermensch killing civilians. That's what is happening. But evidently, at some point of time, and this morning, again, the other news, and it was from the Minister of Defense, from Konashenkov, and it is all over on the mainstream media in Russia, that another brigade, I believe 145th or 155th, was essentially demolished. I mean, they killed something like 600 of them. Now they desperately catch people on the streets of Severodonetsk, Seversk, and, around villages and everything. They literally recruit women and old men.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just like you have people with 65. We are, for the last months, in the Volkssturm phase of Ukrainian army, which for all intents and purposes ceased to exist as the organized and controllable military force. And that's
Yeah.
what people don't understand.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Oh, by the way, parenthetically, it seems this morning there's confirmation that one of the HIMARS is in the possession of the Russians for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
And
sure.
it's not clear if whether they bought it or they captured it, or perhaps it was a little bit of both.
But yeah, it's
Yeah, the Wonder Weapon HIMARS gets
Oh,
captured and
gosh.
shipped
Yeah.
to some Russian factory where they're taking it apart as we're speaking. Yeah. So, but I mean, there's no question. Look, this is my perspective. I've just like you, Larry. Over the last 4 months, I've learned an enormous amount. You know, everything military have just like been a brain dump. And what seems clear is that just like in Monopoly, you know, when you're playing the board game Monopoly, once you start winning and winning faster and faster.
yeah.
The Russians, they are advancing really since Popasnaya. After that, every victory has been faster than the last, and they're just advancing with the same tactics that Alexander described, but just faster, more relentlessly. They're going to get over Kramatorsk, the Kramatorsk line. And so my question becomes to you, which is essentially, where do you guys think that phase 3 is going to go? What do you think that they're going to continue, that the Russians are going to continue with the demilitarization, that they're just going to keep on going after wherever the army is? Because at this point, and correct me if I'm wrong, the last big bulk, excuse me, of the Ukrainian armed forces are defending Kiev.
Yeah.
Are they going to consolidate the Donbass and decide to go all the way to Dnipropetrovsk and get to the Dnieper River and start inching their way north to Kiev and slug it out with the army there? I mean, where do you think that this goes from here? I'll throw it out there. Whoever has an idea, I'd love to hear it.
Well, can we first of all start with what Putin said? Because Putin made some very interesting points when
Please.
he met with the parliamentary leaders about a week ago. He said that the longer this goes on for, the less negotiations there are, the harder it will be to negotiate with us. And the second thing he said is we haven't even begun in earnest yet. Now, that suggests to me that the window for negotiations, to the extent that it exists at all, is closing, and that the Russians are increasingly coming round to the view that the only way this conflict is going to end is in a situation where they achieve a victory which enables them to dictate the terms of the outcome. And when Putin says that they haven't begun in earnest yet, I have to say that points to me to something beyond Donbass. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been lots of rumors about a Russian peace office coming after Donbass is cleared. And there's reports that the Brazilians and the Serbians have been communicating its terms to the West. I predict, this is my own view, that this peace offer is going to be couched in terms which the Russians know perfectly well the Ukrainians and the West are going to refuse. I think its purpose is to consolidate political support for the continuation of this offensive beyond Donbass, both within Russia and internationally. Putin has to be able to tell people like Modi, Xi Jinping, and the leaders of Argentina and all these countries, which are now essentially tilted to Russia, that we are being as reasonable as we can be. We didn't start with the objective of taking Ukraine apart. We're making these peace offers. It's the other side that is going to reject them. So I think we're going to see over the next couple of days, weeks perhaps, a peace offer made public. I think it will be rejected. I think all the indications are that it is going to definitely be rejected, because I think Western leaders are now so boxed in by their own rhetoric that they cannot face the humiliation of accepting the terms that the Russians are going to make. And I think beyond that, we are going to see this offensive continue. And I think that the next point of the offensive will probably be a push to the Dnieper, to places like Dnipropetrovsk, for the Ukrainians, Kharkiv, and we see massive missile strikes on Kherson, north of Kherson region, and perhaps something is going to happen there. But I'm not going to try and second guess Russian military moves, because as Larry said, they want to keep those as opaque as possible, and they'll surprise us with whatever they're planning. But I am quite sure that this conflict will continue through the summer into the autumn, and that the Russians have now decided that whatever it was that they thought that they would do at the beginning, that the possibility of a compromise is almost gone.
Yeah. By the way, I was under the impression, and correct me if I thought wrong. I thought that all four of us were in agreement, or tacit agreement at any rate, that that this would never end in a negotiated ceasefire.
No.
That this would go to total victory. I mean, that's my impression.
I'm absolutely of that view. As I said, there will be a peace offer.
Oh,
it will be reasonable. It will probably say, accept loss of Donbass, accept loss of Kherson region, make commitments about NATO, but the West has already ruled all that out. So how do they turn? And they serve the Ukrainians. So how can they turn round suddenly and say we accept it? Of course, if they were realists,
they would.
But they're not realists. And the Russians know that. We know that. This is, as I said, it's to provide the political justification, the space for the thing to move further west. How far it will go, what the end game is, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure that in the Kremlin, they have some ideas.
Yeah, I don't anticipate that Russia wants to get into a slugging it out street by street in Kiev to take control of Kiev. But I think the first phase of this will be getting up to the Dnieper and controlling that entire line of cities and crossings, north and south, consolidating that. Then at the same time, I think Russia will continue moving to the west, just to the north of Odessa, cut off Odessa, take the rest of Odessa, move into Transnistria, and then consolidate that line. And then once they've got this firm noose around what's left of Ukraine, they'll be negotiating with a knife to their throat. But it's either negotiate or get your throat cut. I mean, it's that simple.
It's one of my favorite scenes, not only in the book, but actually perfectly acted out in David Lynch's version of Dune, still my favorite version of Dune, with Baron Harkonnen, where forms must be obeyed. I made the peace gesture, So this is exactly what it is. And I totally agree with both you, Larry and Alex. That's where it is all going. And there was an increased operational tempo, so to speak, when we talk about standoff weapons. This morning, there was a strike of 48 calibers on Odessa area alone, and you can see a pretty dramatic, videos about it made by the residents of Odessa, and you can see the work of the air defense, Ukrainian air defense, whatever is left of it. They're not that good at intercepting those low-flying, cruise missiles. But there are attacks constantly, and there's a softening of the defenses and the technical part of the issue, so to speak, around Odessa and Nikolaev. So it could be defined for now, but I think so in the end, those things, cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea, is one of the major strategic objectives, and it will be achieved. And after that, whatever is left of Ukraine, as you can state it, speaking with the knife to the throat and say, okay, what are you going to do now? Make an offer.
And one of the real absurdities that's being exposed in this entire process is I know for a fact, talking to a friend of mine who is still involved with military intelligence, at the 1st of April, the senior military commanders in the Department of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were saying, we hope Russia's going to run out of its cruise missiles and its precision missiles. We hope. That was it. They didn't have intelligence. It was just like, oh, pray to God it's going to happen.
Fingers crossed.
Now, so we witnessed yesterday the Congress puts forward an $800 billion defense budget. Here's this $800 billion gorilla that's whining and complaining because they've run out of Stinger missiles. They've run out of 155 or M177, M777 howitzers that shoot 155 millimeter shell. They're running out of all this stuff, and we need more. And this is an $800 billion operation. Meanwhile, here's the Russian army humming along like some incredible manufacturing process where no matter how many of these things they shoot, they still got more. I mean, it's like the miracles of Jesus with some armaments attached to it. They keep multiplying.
Last data, again, I cannot corroborate it, but there was already circulating this number, and it haven't been that Russia used at this stage from the start of SMO 2,500 calibers and Iskanders. These are high precision, long range weapons. And this is more than United States ever used all the Tomahawks throughout all campaigns combined, So it's just like, I believe the United States used, starting from the first Gulf War, from Desert Storm, through all other conflicts combined, something on the order of 2,100 Tomahawks and JASSMs, and primarily. But we are talking about the calibers and Iskanders, already 2,500, so, and that tells you. But then again, that's what I was making videos, and I talk to people all the time, and I try to introduce basic calculations, not only on the operational matters, where you have to calculate not just by the size of the force, but its combat effectiveness. And that's where the operational art comes in. That's where the theory of operation comes in. You have to calculate. And I thought that the Pentagon has this idea. There are excellent papers, written in the, Fort Leavenworth, in the General Staff and Command College. So people know what, or U.S. Army War College, but evidently they don't understand how it works. And that's when you say that, we don't know Russian operational plans. We never will until we have the white paper, which will be issued by the Russian Defense Ministry. I'm still waiting to read about Russian air defense there. But the point is that there is what is called non-diminishing. You cannot touch it. Non-diminishing storage, depot, or if you wish, of the weapons. The same goes for fuel. The same goes for everything. And when you combine, operate as Russian armed forces operate right now, that's a redundancy there, so to speak, is gigantic. But they, of course, never bothered, I don't know, in Pentagon or CIA, let alone U.S. Congress, to look at Russian economy, not in the stupid monetary terms. The fact that Russia produces as much steel as the United States, that's a hint. That's a hint. Russian population is 2 times smaller than United States, yet Russia produces as much of the steel as the United States, and about several times more aluminum.
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that one of the great weaknesses of Western analysis, economic analysis, certainly, is that they measure everything by GDP, and GDP is an incredibly flawed metric. Because of course it counts things, it double counts things to a certain extent. I'm sorry, Alexander, you were going to say something.
Absolutely. I mean, GDP can be incredibly distorting. I mean, let me just give an example. If you have a country where where you don't build houses, and the price of houses as a result rises, that can actually result in increases in GDP,
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
even though no houses are being built.
Yeah.
So this is the point to understand about GDP. It's the person who devised it always said it's a flawed measure. He never intended it to be used in the way that it is. Now,
because it's easy, and the problem also is that it distorts. And I think that's the central thing that I want to focus on, is that so much of what is happening in the West, information in the West, is almost deliberately distorted information to paint a reality that doesn't exist. And so people start jumping off of cliffs thinking that there's water underneath when there's no water. It's just an empty chasm. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Now, mass producing cruise missiles on this kind of scale is an enormous industrial effort. Britain is not capable of it. We are completely incapable of doing this on the kind of scale that the Russians are doing. I mean, I could say that unequivocally. And I know that this is creating a huge amount of dismay. I was reading in the Daily Telegraph back in March, middle of March, that the Russians were about to run out of cruise missiles because the cruise missiles that they make use Ukrainian engines. Well, they might have done once upon a time, but it's been, decades since that was true. So, I mean, that tells you how, again, and that information apparently came from somewhere in the British government. It's bizarre that kind of nonsense is being spread. But there was actually, and I mentioned it in one of my programs, but there was an article by Alex Vershinin, who is an American, logistics expert, and he was writing at for the Royal United Services Institute, which is the think tank, and he was talking about the return of industrial warfare. It surprised me, by the way, that anybody ever thought that industrial warfare had ever gone away, but never mind. But anyway, the return of industrial warfare and how completely unprepared we in the West are about this.
Yes.
And this is, I think, where again, Larry and Andrei write so well, because the way in which our military systems in the West have atrophied in the last decades has been astonishing. I mean, it should never have been allowed to get to this level, but of course it has been. And of course, with the atrophy of your industrial base and your technological and engineering base, then of course your ability to project power, in fact to exercise power, atrophies as well. Because whatever people tell you, we remain ultimately an industrial civilization.
I would suggest we have to change Andrei's name to Isaiah or Jeremiah as the prophet. Because go back and read it, and I'm not getting, this is not a paid advertisement. He's not giving me any kickbacks on this.
I will. Okay, please.
But his book, Losing Military Supremacy, really is, I mean, it is prophetic. It is prescient, and it's alarming when you step back and look at it in terms of he really he takes apart what has happened in the West in terms of losing our industrial capability, losing any production of military capability that actually corresponds with a reasonable strategy. And anybody in the United States that's gone out and tried to buy a car over the last year, the car lots are empty. Now, you can't put new cars in a car lot. How in the hell are you going to create these new weapon systems that rely upon the same kind of computer chips that go into the automobiles? Well, they're not available, and the United States doesn't have the ability to produce it. And while we're at it, the United States itself is not producing rocket engines to get itself to outer space. It had to rely upon Russia for that. They created a bit of a problem when they imposed the sanctions on Russia because, oh my God, now how are we going to get our Uber lift to space? Of course, they have to rely upon Elon Musk, a private sector guy. It is so
a subsidized private sector guy.
That's a good point. That's a good point. But hey, Trump
Isn't doing mean
2018.
tweets anymore.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, make no mistake, the guy is a complete, empty.
But
But point is, for all his bravado and pathos and the hollow sloganeering, in 2018 he commissioned, on his order, the interagency report, which was called "Preserving of the Military-Industrial Base of the United States." It's easily downloadable. It's 2018. Since then, things got much worse, by the way. And let me tell you, it's a horrifying thing if you are, for example, American hawk. But it is also horrifying, for example, for me, because I live in the United States. I want to have their access to basic things, which are not made in China or elsewhere. But guess what? And their data, which is produced there from the personnel, because most of new generation not only not going to, but they radically do not want to be on the manufacturing floor. First, it's difficult. It requires a lot of math and physics, and second, that they would rather be TikTokers and bloggers. But many people don't recognize that the United States right now, in terms of the machine tooling, and it was 2018, actually, I believe now it's much worse, lagging behind machine tooling, lagging behind not only just China, Japan, or what have you. It was lagging behind South Korea and Italy.
yeah, well, Andrei, the problem is that we have an
Sorry?
we have an economic ideology. No, what I want to say is that we have an economic ideology that has been imposed to explain away the offshoring of industry. I mean, this is something that Ross Perot was kicking and screaming about back in 1992, 30 years ago. And he was saying that globalization, NAFTA, the offshoring of industry would be a disaster to the United States. And everybody, Paul Krugman, all the big brains of economics, they said that this post-industrial economy is the way of the future. And what we are seeing now is that when we have actual political conflict that leads to war, the post-industrial nations, in that famous phrase by Warren Buffett, it's only when the tide rolls out that you realize who's swimming naked. And we have this problem here where the West has no industry, no industrial base, and there's something else too that's I think catastrophic, that the weapons manufactured by the West are so fragile. I saw a video earlier today. Some guy was analyzing European armed forces. Most of the European weapons, their aircraft, their tanks, they're unusable because they're in a majority of it, anywhere from 30% for tanks, 50% for helicopters. The Germans have 8 submarines and none of them are operational. They are all being repaired, and they have these incredibly delicate and complex weapons that are useless because they're too fragile. They break at a moment's notice. And so the point I'm trying to make is that, we have seen deindustrialization, and we all mock the Zelensky regime for its propaganda and all of its bullshit. But this is what all of the Western armies have become. It's not Zelensky is an outlier. The Zelensky regime, with all its bullshit and propaganda that believes that the war is actually the war on Twitter. No, that's what all of the Western armies believe. And so that's why I'm terrified of the following. And I want to know your opinion on this, which is, if the United States gets involved in a war with either Russia or Iran or China, as per the Three Lighthouses speech of Mike Pompeo, if they get involved in an actual direct war with one of these three powers, they're going to lose catastrophically. And so my great fear is that because of the humiliating loss, perhaps the loss of an aircraft carrier or some other loss like that, they decide to use nuclear weapons. What do you gentlemen think are the odds of that happening?
I still think that the forces of restraint will be just too great, but I am less confident of that than I would have been 5 years ago. I mean, that's to answer that question. But can I just say, Gonzalo, you've made a lot of very, very important points, and I'd just like to cover just a few. First of all, about Western weapon systems. I mean, one of the fundamental differences, and I think Andrei and Larry can both comment on this perhaps, but one of the fundamental differences about Russian approach to weapons procurement and Western ones is that Russian weapon systems go through a very prolonged process of being tested in very, very tough conditions by the Russian military. They're not brought into service before there is certainty that they actually will work in battlefield conditions. So that's one of the reasons why you see this sometimes this very long lag between a system that appears and then is released to the military. In Europe, at least, I don't know about the United States, we don't do that because, of course, the politicians want to see the weapons with the troops, and of course, the business interests want the big orders. So it's that already has a very, very bad distorting effect. The second is, of course, if you are in a position like we are in the West, where increasingly political leaders think that the Western powers are more powerful than they are, and have little understanding of what war is all about, which is a point Andrei makes repeatedly in his books, then of course you're in a very, very dangerous situation, because those political leaders have that massive tendency to over gamble, to take excessive and reckless risks. Now, it's difficult to convey how amateur European leaders actually are. I think it's worse in Europe than it is in the United States. Look at the political profile of the leaders who are now competing to become British Prime Minister. I mean, I can tell you, and I'm British, I live in London, I follow the news here very closely, that the person who many people think will become our next Prime Minister is somebody called Penny Mordaunt. I'd never even heard of her. I mean, this is somebody who's just appeared out of nowhere. And you look at her background, and she doesn't actually have one. I mean, her entire background is as a person who's risen up, within the political party system, as a sort of advisor, whatever it is that they do. I mean, I'm not even sure exactly what it is that they do. And this is true of some of the others as well. Not one of them has any background in engineering, in science, in technological matters, in industry, in business. Tom Tugendhat, who's one of them, has a military background, but as a middle-ranking officer. Never somebody who most people would say has much strategic insight. And they don't understand how complex war is. And the worst is, of course, they don't understand that they don't understand it. I mean, they are unaware of their own lack of knowledge. I mean, I said that I have experience of logistics. I mean, I have a completely humanities background. But I had in my legal work to get involved with people who were involved in that sort of thing. I worked with engineers. I worked with those sort of people. I very quickly discovered my limitations. I understood how to take advice. These people just don't have that kind of background. They don't understand the limits of their own knowledge. They don't know how to take advice. So it's very easy to see how they could do something, they could rush into something that they don't really understand. And then, of course, it all goes hideously wrong. And then the temptation to double down could begin to grow. And then they might do something utterly reckless and frankly irrational of the kind that you just said. I hope and believe it won't happen, because I still think that there are people at the highest levels of the military system in the United States who will say, Mr. President, if they get that kind of order, what you're asking us to do is utterly and completely wrong. And I hope that that kind of advice will prevail. but I'm not as confident about it
No.
as I was 5 years ago.
Can I just point out something really quick? 2 points. Number one, you yourself, Alexander, always say that these people, they only know how to double down. They
Yeah.
never have a reverse gear.
Absolutely.
That's point number one. And point number two, Larry can back me up on this, and probably Andrei has heard of this too. You know, in New York City, they released a public service announcement of what to do when a nuclear blast happens. I
That
lived in the United States during the Cold War. They never had those ads in the early 80s when they had, you know, remember that movie The Day After with Jason Robards, you know, about the, not even then did they have such ads, and they have them now. And so I'm wondering to myself, you know, are they actually contemplating this at this time? Larry, Andrei, I throw it to you guys.
Larry, you
Okay, I'll go first. I don't share Alexander's optimism about the possibility of there being a few wise heads around Biden that will weigh in with some restraint. Biden is surrounded by a bunch of kindergartners. I mean, that we have never seen such a group of no talent, ignorant folks in positions of power in the history of the United States. Whatever flaws George H.W. Bush had, he was at least accompanied by Brent Scowcroft and James Baker, who, again, flawed men, but still they were smart, they knew the world, and they were pragmatic, and they had some grounding in history. I mean, even Robert Gates, who, you know, I had my run-ins with him when he was at the Central Intelligence Agency, but still, Gates was not a fool. I mean, we've got legitimate fools. What is, I think, the most dangerous flashpoint right now, and I've heard this from multiple sources that are in the Pacific Command. It's called PACOM, and the commander of PACOM is a reckless, crazy person. It's probably the best way to describe it. That he is deliberately taking provocative steps, like conducting air flights along China's international air border, putting ships into the China Sea, deliberately trying to provoke the Chinese. And I think there stands a significant risk if you had to weigh Ukraine, Iran, and China. I think the first place where any shooting is going to break out will be China, not any of the other two. And it will be because of this kind of recklessness. And the Chinese will finally say, you know, we've had enough. And they'll launch a hypersonic missile, take out a couple of ships, and then all of a sudden the United States is going to be left figuring out what to do. The problem the United States faces, and this is another point that Andrei made in his book, that the United States does not have any kind of effective air defense system or system to defend against missiles. Russia does, China to a lesser extent does. And therefore, if you're going to contemplate launching a missile strike on someone, in that calculation, you have to take into consideration that whatever you launch may not actually reach the target because they have a way to shoot it down, whereas you don't have anything to stop what they're going to shoot back at you, which means you're completely vulnerable. It's like you're going to get into a gunfight with a guy who's wearing body armor and a helmet with a ballistic shield. What are your chances? Yeah, you may get the first shot off, but that shot's not necessarily going to penetrate. And I think that's, you know, what we're facing here is that, yeah, there are people who are talking recklessly about using nuclear weapons, but I still believe that within the Pentagon, there's still a military planner or two who's going to say, oh, you know, wait a second. If we do this, it's going to elicit this likely response, and we don't have an answer to that response.
I think one of the reasons for this absolutely, sophomoric, to put it mildly, bravado and downright lies, open propaganda from such people like Petraeus or Keane or whoever, those former Pentagon guys who are now abusing their sinecures and all kinds of their think tanks, is one of them of being sore losers, because if you ask the question, I am on the record since who knows when, combined West, NATO as a whole cannot realistically fight a conventional war with Russia in Eastern Europe and not to sustain catastrophic losses. That's what I'm on record. I'm talking about only conventional means. That means without use of the nuclear weapons. Russia obviously has a very specific criteria on the use of nuclear weapons. They are well prescribed and described in the Russian military doctrine, Articles 26, 27, which include obviously the use of the high precision weapons, which could be dual, could be conventional, or could be nuclear armed, for the power containment, and if of course there is a direct danger to the existence of the Russian state as such, Russia will use nuclear weapons. But point is, there are some people, not necessarily in Pentagon, but definitely in the neocon cabal, which basically penetrated all foreign policy decision centers in the United States, who do not mind to see a really major war, conventional or what's the name of it? Even nuclear, tactical nukes, for example, war in Europe, because they are one-trick ponies. They didn't learn history. Or as Phil Giraldi wrote, excellent piece long ago, 2007, in then functional Huffington Post, where he wrote that neocons are really good writing about war. They are very bad at fighting it, And fact is, I will challenge even Phil's assertion here. They are not good at writing about war either, especially modern war. But the point is, they want to step in and, do their post-World War II thing. Again, they think that they can do it. They do not understand that basically, first, United States and NATO have to accumulate required force, which has to be numbered in millions to even have a chance to basically do anything against Russian armed forces. And David Ochmanek, the big honcho from Rand Corporation, who in 2017 wrote and he's a big honcho for air operations there. He wrote in 2017 that, we will need 68 air wings to basically deal with Russia in Europe. Then in 2019, he suddenly changes his tune and he writes openly, and you can look it up on YouTube during the one of the roundtables at Rand. And then, of course, number of the media outlets quoted him that if we fight Russia or China, we have our ass handed to us. Our air forces will not be able, most of them will not be able to take off from the airfields because they will be destroyed in real war. So, change of the mood. So, what do they want to do now? And Larry, I agree with Larry. It's actually China. And the reason they also think about kind of doing some things around China is because of what I write nonstop. And people even accuse me of being racist against Chinese. What a stupid idea. I admire Chinese culture. I admire their achievements, and especially in the economy, how they basically pulled from poverty 1 billion of people, so it's absolutely amazing achievement. But there are some things in the military industrial complex and the military issue which Chinese are still not there yet. And one of them, the United States Navy, has an outstanding submarine force. It's a world-class, first-rate. It is superior on every single respect to Chinese submarines. And that means that what the United States can, and that's why AUKUS has been created. It's to leverage this fundamental and radical advantage United States Navy has against Chinese is to cut their shipping lanes of communications over in the Indian Ocean. Because when you have such submarine force, and the United States doesn't have diesel submarines, which are primarily green water subs in operation, they are not that good for operating on shipping lanes of communications in the Indian Ocean. When you have quantitative and outstanding qualitative advantage. So yeah, that's the chance for the United States to score a big one. especially after humiliations in Afghanistan. And now we have a gigantic humiliation coming in Ukraine. So what's left?
Yeah, because it's to circle back and to use that famous phrase of circling back, to circle back to the Ukraine situation. It seems pretty clear. You guys tell me whenever I say something that you disagree with. Number one, the Russian army is going to win the Battle of the Donbass. Number two, the Russian army will continue to advance through Ukraine, even as there are talks to negotiate, but the negotiations will go nowhere. Number three, NATO will never put boots on the ground in Ukraine because they're frankly too scared of the Russian response. And so, if you all agree with those premises, my thinking is that as it becomes very clear that Russia is inevitably going to win this conflict, the Americans are simply going to, the Americans and well, to a lesser extent, the Europeans, but the foreign policy establishment of Europe is going to begin to pretend that the Ukraine situation no longer exists, sort of like to turn their attention elsewhere deliberately, sort of like, it becomes like the ugly stepchild that you don't want to look at. Does this make any sense to you, Alexander? Because that seems to me the direction that we're going to be headed in, that the Americans will just decide, I don't want to have anything to do with this, and just pretend it never happened. Am I wrong?
I think that may be possible in the US. I mean, I obviously this is, I don't know how it feels about in the US that you can just, park Ukraine and the debacle there and pretend it hasn't happened and start talking about Taiwan or the Pacific or something else. In Europe, of course, it's completely different.
Yeah.
Because Ukraine is part of Europe. I mean, it's part of our geographical hinterland. And this is, I think, the point to say, if there is the kind of debacle in Ukraine that all of us expect, and by the way, I'm not convinced there's going to be negotiations. I think if Putin puts together the kind of offer I think he's likely to, I strongly suspect it will be a take it or leave it offer. It will not be, let's sit down and talk and, discuss the details. I don't think that's what he's going to, I don't think this is what's coming at all. But anyway, assuming there's going to be the kind of debacle that we all expect and which I firmly believe we are going to see, this is going to have a very, very big effect in Europe, especially in Southern Europe. And of course, in parts of Eastern and Central Europe as well. I mean, it will mean that countries which have assumed that the United States is, the winner of the Cold War and is the country that we should align with, they're going to start to say to themselves, well, just a moment, is this really the case? If we get into a fight with the Russians, are the Americans really going to be able to come to our rescue? And we have a real possibility of realignments. I mean, Turkey is already behaving in its own complicated way. But, you see countries in the Balkans, Bulgaria, some of the former Yugoslav states, they might start to think things through differently. You could start to see Slovakia, perhaps even the Czech Republic, they're not under the current government, perhaps Italy, certainly in Greece. They will all start to make their own calculations. And it was the other risk is that other countries which have other feelings towards Russia, if you like, Poland, or at least the present Polish government, Poland is a complex society, and you mustn't assume that the views of its government necessarily reflect all the opinion in Poland. But this particular government, I can see that it might say to itself, if the United States has failed in Ukraine, if we now have the Russians once again on our borders, because that's effectively what it will mean, well, we've got to start taking steps of our own to protect ourselves from the Russians, because ultimately the United States can't do it. And that has to mean, and it's always this possibility in Europe that countries might start to say, well, maybe we should start thinking about getting a deterrent of our own. So you could start to see, and fairly quickly, the whole European system that we've seen built up since the end of the Cold War you could start to see cracks and problems start to mount and start to unravel. And if you move further west, in Britain, in Germany above all, people were going to say, well, just a moment, we went through all of that, and for what?
Yeah.
And that's going to create a major crisis, I think, with our own political classes in Germany and Britain. And can I just say, Andrei, if your experience of the Americans being incompetent and amateur, the same for Larry, you haven't seen ours. They win that race without any competition, frankly. So as I said, you know, lots of things to think about. So it may not be so straightforward for the US to just say, you know, Europe, you know, this has all gone wrong. Let's move on to the next one. They could do that with Libya. They could do that with Iraq. They could do that with Afghanistan. Europe, it's much more complicated. So I think they might try. And I think also there's this idea, you know, that China is the great hegemonic rival, which, by the way, I think this fear in the US is overstated. I think, like Andrei, I think China has many more problems than people in the West perhaps recognize. But, you know, having said that,
of them,
absolutely, you can see some of them. But having said that, I can see why there might be the temptation to move east. But it may very well be that, you know, this crisis, if there's a debacle in Ukraine, you know, will start to take forms which any American government might be pulled back to have to try to address.
Yeah. You know, I think this is like a bad bachelor party just gone completely to hell in Las Vegas. Okay? Because here's the United States is the bachelor, and he's got all of his buddies with him. They're from the EU. Let's go down to the casino, and we're going to bet everything we have because I've got an inside track that we're going to beat the house. And in the process, they're drinking excessively. They're spending everything they have. And when morning comes, they're broke. They're drunk. And they have nothing to show for it. And it's time to settle up with the hotel, and the credit cards have reached their limit, and they're being turned down. And so as a result, the unity among that group tends to fragment rather quickly.
Yeah.
And the survival instincts kick in. And that's what you're starting to see with the resignation, you know, with Draghi, the prime minister, trying to bail out in Italy. And with Schultz now, the latest on him, you know, he was trying to date rape a bunch of women, apparently. That's alleged, that's the allegation. That's not going to go well in Germany. And then the no name for Boris Johnson that's being touted, as Alexander pointed out. So at the end of spending all of this money, and it's a very consequential sum of money and weaponry and personnel in Ukraine, and they have nothing to show for it at the end. Absolutely nothing. It'll be, you know, I think it's going to be a tremendous, almost a death blow for NATO, because after that point, people are going to say, why join up? They keep missing the point of the logistics that, you know, Andrei pointed out earlier, and Alexander acknowledged, that think back to when the United States put together its invasion of Ukraine, of Iraq in 2003. And they had a 6-month buildup to get the troops there. And recently when you say, oh, they're going to deploy the 101st Airborne. The 101st Airborne doesn't carry heavy weapons. They don't carry crew-served weapons. They don't have a tank regiment backing them up. They don't have a tank brigade, a tank platoon. They don't have an artillery. So all they are is a speed bump if they got into a ground war with any Russian units. So it is complete delusion. And so that's why, for me, the best image is just a group of guys got too drunk and went to the tables down in Vegas as part of a bad bachelor party, and it's turned out as bad as it could be.
Well, I agree. Hang on, Andrei. I just want to make a point, and then I want to pass it to you. But Larry, I completely agree, and good metaphor, by the way. My thinking about Europe is that Europe committed suicide, and it's over. I mean, this is my view, and Andrei, I want to bring you in on this, because you know, the policies that the EU implemented to show the Russians and sanctions and so forth. I mean, it's very clear that it boomeranged and it's annihilating the European economy. The euro broke parity with the dollar. It's now below. It's 98 cents to the euro or something like that. And Europe is going to have rolling blackouts. Europe is going to go without food, not only because of the Russia situation, but also because of the internal problems with the farmers in the Netherlands, which I know very well. I lived there for 2 years. It has all kinds of problems. And here is the key point. And Andrei, that's why I wanted to preface this before asking you. Putin himself has said, we haven't done anything in response to the sanctions.
Yeah.
Andrei, what do you think the Russians will do? What will Putin do when it comes to the fall, when it comes to the winter, November, December, when Europe starts to really hurt? Do you think that is when Putin will, eke out his pound of flesh? Or do you think that he will dangle resources in order to get something from the Europeans? What do you think? Do you think he's going to just use it as revenge, or is he going to make a play of some sort?
No, there will be no revenge. But a few days ago, Vladimir Putin, talking to the captains of industries, was very specific when he stated that, please, Gazprom, Rosneft, and others, kind of increase your efforts in the transitioning or transferring our energy resources, which are natural gas, oil, and other things, to the Eastern, or meaning Asian markets. So the situation with the Nord Stream still is not very clear, But the point is that, Russia will be shutting off their basically economic and energy supply to Europe, and it's already in progress. And eventually there will be Iron Curtain. And you have to understand, this time, it's not just that Europe, you cannot blame Stalin, or Molotov for doing anything like this. In all my life, of all my 60 years of life, never in my life, and I am a Cold Warrior. I have basically a graduate degree in how to sink U.S. Navy, and it's never in my life, when seeing Russian people, I saw so much condescension and contempt towards the West. And it's a genuine, it has nothing to do with propaganda. Actually, Russian media are much freer than Western one, and the point is that it's a real break. It's a real disassociation and saying goodbye to combined West. And just to illustrate it to you, yesterday, or day before yesterday, on the Bastille Day of Bastille, national holiday of France, United States government sent to French embassy in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yes.
Oh, my God.
The transgender, whatever that thing is, pardon me, I mean, he, she, whatever, and...
Now, Andrei, don't be transphobic.
And then they had this other dude with fluid sexuality. What's his name? Whatever. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not good at it. Okay, I'm old-fashioned. So and
I'm sorry.
And these people, they came to French embassy to show the support from the American people to the French Fifth Republic. I would if I would have been French ambassador, and I'm not sure we're talking about all time, French diplomacy, which was a lot of, Gaullism in it, and independent. No, if I would be normal French ambassador, I would probably resign, or I would issue I don't know. But it is what it is, okay? So the reaction in Russian media today and people, that's what's wonderful about, the internet. You can gauge to a degree, obviously very inaccurate, Turkey. But you can gauge to a degree reaction of people, and I can tell you, overwhelming. I mean, it's like 99.99% of Russians who saw it, they said, freaking Iron Curtain now, we don't want to deal with these people at all. Over. Please, don't touch us, don't go around us, shut it down. And that's what it is. And these are talking not of people my generation. I'm talking about young people too. And especially this generation of those 30 and 40 years old who are beginning to go into their top notch, and top positions in the politics, and in the corporate, area. So that's what it is. And it's not just economic. It is spiritual, it's cultural, it's fundamental, it's civilizational. And that is, but I can say, listen, I will need to go in 5 minutes. I can tell you one thing, and I constantly stress it. Yes, Western civilization, as we know, it's done. But what I would say, which is absolutely strange and bizarre twist, ironic twist of history and practical geopolitics, and I wrote about it, and when you go today to Russia, this is where Western civilization, the best of it, survives today. And by best of Western civilization, we are talking about rational thinking, number of the true Enlightenment values, including the, personal freedoms of things like that. But they are limited, of course, by the common sense and cultural preferences and, So, but yeah, the West, as we know, is over, and it saddens me to say, hey, I'm a Western man. So I grew up with Shakespeare, Bach, Beethoven, Pink Floyd, it's all gone. It's all gone today.
I can't say I disagree. I have to say, living in Europe, and I just get to talk about the economy, what we have done to our economic system in Europe is astonishing. And of course, the other thing that I just wanted to say, and this is, I want to say this, with Andrei here, that the response in Europe to this this Ukrainian crisis, this wave of visceral loathing to Russia, I have to say, both shocked me and left me profoundly ashamed. I mean, it was something that I never imagined the depths to which it went. And it was like you saw a sort of mask falling off. It was as if all of these European leaders have finally, and not just leaders, this is what's so disturbing, journalists, all kinds of people, cultural figures. It was as if for them it was almost a moment of liberation, that they were almost excited to be able to go after Russia at last, as they saw it, and to all unite and to be them and to be how they really are, in a sense. And I have to say that has left me profoundly shaken, deeply, deeply concerned about my continent. And I'm a European to my fingertips. I'm Greek. I live in Britain. I'm absolutely bound up with this continent, and I'm desperately sorry where it's going.
Alexander, I've given this issue a great deal of thought because I thought exactly as you do. As Andrei is, I am a man of the West. And I take my intellectual tradition from the Enlightenment. And I studied philosophy and history, and in that context, a Eurocentric, if you want to put it in that term. And I was, just like you, Alexander, deeply disturbed by the vitriolic hatred towards Russia. And I've given it a great deal of thought. And I've come to an idea that I'll float by you guys, and you tell me what you think. You see, over the last 50 years, the concept of racism being a very bad thing, and that we should not be racist under any set of circumstances, and that not only should we not be racist, but we should not point out obvious problems with different groups of people. Because children recognize, as infants, as toddlers, they recognize patterns, and we all stereotype in all kinds of different ways in the simplest forms. Because stereotyping is a heuristic in order to understand the world. We need it. Okay, but you see somebody dressed up in a black uniform with a name tag and a silver star and a black cap, and you know, on his back it says police, and you figure that's a policeman. That's a stereotype, of course. We all use stereotypes all the time, but we have been taught because of racism that we cannot stereotype anymore. And I think that because of mass migration, because of these demographic changes that have been shocking to people, especially in Europe, where they, on the one hand, welcome all of these foreign people to their countries, where their local ethnicities become literally a minority in their own country, as is happening in Germany. Germany will soon, ethnic Germans will be a minority, an absolute minority very soon now. Well, all of this leads to a resentment that cannot be expressed. And I think, and this is my suggestion, that when the Putin bad, the Russians are doing this evil thing, I think all of this pent up resentment towards an inability to express disagreement with these immigration policies in Europe and whatnot, it found a focus point, and it fell on the Russians with this vitriolic, over the top Russophobia that doesn't have much to do with the Russians, but is just a pent up emotion of all the rest of it. I mean, frankly, the contact of Russians with Europeans is minimal. I mean, you're talking tourists and a few people who migrate there, which is inconsequential compared to the flood of, say, Syrian refugees, African refugees, and other Middle Eastern people. Those are much more, but everybody in Europe is taught not to be racist towards them, and so they turn to the Russians. And
I think you may have a point, but what worries me, what worries me about this, and by the way, I think this is where there is a difference between Europe and the US, because it seems to me, and I mean, reading things in the US, I think there's less of this in the US.
Yeah, it is.
The problem is in Europe.
Yeah.
This problem, this Russophobic wave, is a recurring pattern.
Yeah.
You follow our history. I mean, every couple of decades, somebody comes along and tries to unite Europe and then march on Russia. We seem to do this to ourselves time and time again. Now, I thought we'd got past this. I mean, and I'm very, very horrified, really disturbed to find that, this well of Russian, Russophobia, as you mentioned it, which clearly has these very deep roots in Europe, and deep roots which I do not understand, that, it's still there, and it is still obviously as powerful as it is. One of the reasons, by the way, unquestionably, is that Europeans don't know Russian very well. Very few Europeans speak Russian. I can't think of a single European leader today who speaks Russian. Angela Merkel could, but she's gone. And, maybe some of the East European leaders do. But, generally speaking, if you're talking about Western Europe, the ignorance of Russia is profound. We know a little Russian music, Tchaikovsky. We know a couple of novels, Tolstoy's War and Peace, Pushkin to a certain much lesser extent, Chekhov to an inordinate extent, and we completely misunderstand him. We impose our own ideas on him, which are utterly wrong, by the way. But that's another story. But we are very, very ignorant about Russia, and that we don't travel there very much. We do have Russians coming more, but, we don't really mix or understand them very well. And, of course, this problem of ignorance, perhaps, makes it easier to project certain very deep-seated phobias within European society onto Russia. I think what you say, Gonzalo, has some truth, but it can't be the whole truth.
No,
because,
it's not
as
the
I
whole
said,
truth.
it is this recurring problem. And I'm afraid that Russia has been forced to carry this thing because it comes from within us.
Okay, guys, I have to apologize because I have to bow out. I have other things to do starting at noon. And so is it okay, Gonzalo? Can I go?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and you know, feel free, and it's great having you on. Thanks
Well,
very
thank
much.
you, guys. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Gonzalo, for
Thank
having
you.
me. Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
talk to
and
you later. I really have to run. It was
go.
pleasure. It was pleasure, absolutely, talking to you guys. And now let me get the heck out of here. So,
Okay.
Well,
carry on without me, sirs.
As
Take
Andrei
it easy.
As Andrei
Yeah.
departs, let me comment on what Alec. I think there's another more fundamental reason for the European hatred of Russia, and it goes back that the Russians are the only ones in the last 300 years to completely exterminate the royal class. When they killed
Well,
the Tsar, you know, they got rid of them,
could be the
and
part of the case, yeah.
all of a sudden, the landed titles, the lords, the whole aristocracy was put at risk.
I can tell you one thing, Larry. Our common friend, so to speak,
Yes.
Mr. And I'm talking about the quote unquote friend, Colonel Lang. Few years ago, he wrote a very interesting thing before I go, and he stated that when going through his whatever the course in the intelligence school in Garmisch, you know, NATO, all that thing. He said we had, and it's in there. It's actually I quoted in my first book. He said the guy who was teaching us about Russia was the former white officer, pure Russian. You know, he hated not just Bolsheviks. That what shocked him. He hated Russians as a whole. So can you imagine what those people teach there? So there you go. People still think that Solzhenitsyn wrote the documentary when it was most of it is complete fiction. So there you go. But guys, I have to leave you. Thank you. It was pleasure talking to you guys, and I hope we'll do it sometime again. Thank you, Gonzalo, for having me. Guys, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Can I just also say, Gonzalo, in about 10 minutes, I also have to move on, but I'm here for 10 minutes.
Gonzalo, are you still there? Or I guess he's
Yes.
he's muted.
He's muted.
But you know, I
muted.
think I've been really stunned by the level of vitriol and hatred at all things Russian. That it's just not, you know, it's one thing to vilify Putin, and Putin becomes this cartoon figure that he's worse than Stalin, which shows that, you know, the level of ignorance with respect to history. And yet, on top of it, then they lump in every Russian hockey player, soccer player, tennis player, you know, pick your sport. And then on top of it, musicians. And it's just, it goes, and it's just by virtue of being Russian. And without any, consciousness about why Russia was pushed into this position, that this was not something that Russia had been planning quietly for years, like Hitler with his Operation Barbarossa, but that this was, in fact, as much, it was provoked, deliberately provoked by the West, in terms of using Ukraine as a bait to try to destroy Russia. And I think the ultimate goal in this, in destroying Russia, is to get access to its vast mineral resources.
I think it's absolutely. I mean, I think the last plays a very big role in this. I think that if you're talking about what has caused European leaders and lots of people in Europe to suddenly become to develop a very powerful anti-Russian narrative over the last 20 years, is the fact that Putin came along and the great exploitation of Russian resources that everybody thought was going to happen in Europe, that didn't happen. And I definitely think that is true. I think there's another factor as well, which is that all these countries in Europe, Germany, France, Britain, Spain, we've all been great powers at various times, and we've all lost that position. I mean, we're not great powers. The United States is a great power. China is a great power. Russia is a great power. Russia is the only European great power of the 18th and 19th century that is still standing. And so the others resent the fact that it's still playing at the top of the table, and they are not.
Right.
But, you know, one can explain things in all kinds of ways. One can come up with many, many explanations. But this strain of Russophobia in European culture goes back deep into the 19th century. I definitely think, by the way, what you say about, you know, they eliminated their aristocracy, they eliminated their monarchy, they did all those things, and they didn't just do it, they did it in a very thorough and ruthless way. It is extremely unnerving for Europeans. And they've not created a kind of substitute aristocracy in its place, in the way that, I'm sorry to say, you have, to a certain extent, recently, in the last few decades, started to do in the United States, with products like Jake Sullivan and such people being, I think, sort of examples of, you know, where that comes from.
Yeah, amen.
But they haven't done that. The Russians haven't done that, and that undoubtedly inflames feeling in every European country. And, you know, I don't like talking all the time about the WEF and all of the things that people talk about, because I think it's overstated. But I want to repeat again about what it is. It is fundamentally European old money. It starts with the old European aristocratic, wealthy, bourgeois class, aristocratic bourgeois class. They go to a Swiss mountain resort for their skiing. They all get together. They all talk about how they're going to reshape the world. And of course, they have the money behind them and the influence and the ability always. And this is something that always astonishes me. They have this ability always to impress Americans, which I do not understand why Americans are so impressed by Europeans.
Oh, that's
they
easy.
always imagine them to be much more intelligent.
It's the accent.
Truly
The
are.
accent.
Well, the accent. Well, I know all about the accent. But I mean, you know, it's,
you have to understand. Most of the people in American leadership are fundamentally unsophisticated people, and so that's why they're so impressed by, frankly, trivial people. Because I've met a lot of these people in places like WEF and whatnot, and they're just, you know, great accents, great table manners, but you know, they're inconsequential. But yeah, the Americans fall for it. By the way, I just wanted to, I muted myself before when I was speaking. I hadn't realized it. I just want to tell the chat that links to Larry's website and Andrei's website are below. And of course, link to Alexander's channel is also below in the description. Yes. I urge you to go check them all out. Guys, we can go as long as you want. Because I've got nothing better to do except wait for Russian artillery.
I'm afraid I'm not in that privileged position. I mean, I have family. I have family obligations, which you know about, Gonzalo, which I'm afraid I'm obliged to honor. So in a few minutes, I have.
Let's do this. Let's wind it down. You know, it's always better to, you know, leave early and not overstay your welcome. So what are your final thoughts? Because I'm going to wind down the whole thing. And so what are your final thoughts, both of you, about the current situation? And let me go first. I just want to put it on the table. My thinking is that the Russians will win this war, and they will occupy all of Ukraine. I think that there will be some sort of mass mobilization, not for combat troops, but rather for occupation forces, because to occupy a country as large as Ukraine will take a lot of manpower. And I think that as you head further west, there will be more guerrilla activity, saboteur activity. And so the Russians will simply need the manpower, but it'll be an occupation force. And over the next 2 to 4 years, they will dismember Ukraine and eventually bring in half of Ukraine into the Russian Federation.
and the other half, as I've been saying for a while now, will become a rump Ukraine state with a puppet regime. That's where I think things are going. Where do you guys think things are going?
I'll defer to Alexander first, since this is on the tightest timeline.
Yeah, well, I'll simply say I'm not sure what the Russians are planning to do. I think that may very well have been their thinking at the beginning of this conflict. I think they may have said to themselves, we will liberate all the Russian-speaking areas, we'll set up a rump Ukraine, we'll try and control it through our proxies, and that will be the settlement that we want for this conflict. I suspect that deep down in Moscow, they may be having doubts about this. They may be saying to themselves that any kind of Ukraine that is independent, nominally independent, might be difficult to control.
Really?
And that, I think that's maybe what they're saying. And that they better, in fact, to try to find some way of bringing it all even more closely integrated into Russia than the kind of plan that you outlined at the beginning. I don't know what their thinking is, what their planning is. One thing I am sure of is that they do have a plan.
Oh, yeah.
It may be evolving and changing
Yeah.
all the time, but I don't get the sense of a government that's making things up from one day to the next. That doesn't seem to me how it's working out at all. It looks very methodical and very systematic. And I think at all times they have a clear end game in view.
Yeah, we're still waiting to find out the results of yesterday's National Security Council meeting in Russia. I think Alexander and I both thought that we would hear something by close of business yesterday.
Yeah.
So the fact that nothing came out of that, I think, is telling, because I think some very consequential decisions were made about the end game, and that Putin was getting all the ducks in a row, and that Shoigu's emergence this morning with announcing that they're going to end this artillery and missile threat to Donetsk was not just idle chat. They're going to accomplish that. What Andrei pointed out earlier, that the advanced Russian units with the most modern tanks and the actual military units that are had been held out of the fight, that the fact that they're now being brought forward, I think, is further sign Russia is going to push forward rapidly to the Dnieper. But within that, they're not going to. They are going to ultimately accomplish that mission: denazify, demilitarize. And the demilitarize means they're going to eliminate any ability of Ukraine to pose a threat. I think one of the elements that they agreed on yesterday, this is my pure speculation, but that they will now target centers where there are Western intelligence officers, CIA, MI6, personnel that are there to work and advise with the Ukrainians, and U.S. military personnel as well, that's now a green-lit target. They'll hit those, they'll destroy them, they'll kill those people. It's going to send a subtle message. It will be up to the West to admit that it had its personnel in those places getting killed. But I think Russia is now, I think its patience has basically been exhausted. They've been trying to, Gonzalo is familiar with the expression in Spanish, se confunde el bueno con el buenudo. They confuse being the good with being a fool. Yeah. And I think Russia is tired of being taken for a fool.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can I just say, I think you're absolutely right, Larry, about the Security Council. If you look at the Russian official communique, the account of the Security Council meeting that the Kremlin has published, it is unbelievably short. It tells you absolutely nothing about what was said there and what was discussed. And that's clearly a sign that very important things were discussed. I mean, it's inconceivable that there would be any other reason to keep it as tightly secret as it is. I mean, obviously, with the Security Council, lots of things get talked about, and a lot of it is kept confidential and private and secret and all this. But this entire meeting, I think they've just published about 3 lines of some comments that Putin made on some innocuous issue, which is I think, a very, very good sign that something very major was indeed discussed, just as Larry says.
Yeah, and by the way, yesterday at the Duma, the extraordinary meeting, one of the things was that they moved the head of the military-industrial complex, basically, to the head of the space agency. Do either one of you? I forget the name of the gentleman. I don't have my notes on that in front of me, but
Birov,
you know what I'm I beg your
Yeah,
pardon?
so it was quite a big. Actually, it's an important. I think that is an important event. There's quite a significant reshuffle. So Rogozin, who was in charge of the space program, and who's essentially a politician, has now been moved to the Kremlin, where he's going to be playing some role. And one suspects it's going to be Ukrainian related. So he's going to be a sort of political person who's going to be sent to deal with Ukrainian issues. Borisov, who was in charge of the military-industrial complex before, who's, by the way, got a military background.
Yeah.
He's now been put in charge of the space program, which means working, by the way, with the Chinese, but it also means building up satellites, doing all that kind of thing. So that's quite a big role, and Rogozin wasn't apparently terribly good at it. So you need a good administrator. And interestingly, the person they put in charge of the military-industrial complex is a man called Manturov, who is an industry expert. He was formerly Russia's industry minister. So they're putting a logistics industry expert in charge of the military-industrial complex. And he made a statement almost immediately saying what his priorities were. More drones, obviously, more advanced weapons, that kind of thing. But he also seemed to be saying that from now on, it's not going to work on an American-style commercial basis. It's going to be more tightly controlled, more centralized, in effect, more of a mobilization type military-industrial complex than we've seen up to now. So that's quite indicative, I think, of another shift in economic direction and political direction as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So this gentleman, Rogozin, sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
He got moved from the space agency because at this time it's believed that he's going to play some role in the post-war Ukraine.
Yes, I think the thing to understand about Rogozin is that he's not a technocrat. He's not a person who's, whose natural abilities are, managing giant organizations. So he was always an odd fit in some ways to run the space program. He's a politician, a rather outspoken politician. For a long time, he was Russia's ambassador to NATO, and he made quite a name for himself there by some very acerbic comments. And he had his own political party, very much on the right-wing nationalist side of things in Russia.
Okay. So he's a Russian nationalist.
Absolutely, very much so. And as I said, he's somebody that people have, are aware of. He's a political figure. And it's quite likely, because he's a politician, that he's going to be sent to Ukraine basically to oversee the political side of the integration of these territories, and perhaps conceivably to deal with whatever political leadership in Kiev is left when this military operation is concluded. So it's logical that he would be placed in that kind of role.
Because I was wondering if it was somebody had fallen out of favor or had been just shuffled off, but it's really just a reshuffle to put people in the right positions for their qualities at this time.
I think that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and actually, I think in doing it, it's a sign that they're going to ramp up the production on the military side and all these critical weapon systems. That unlike the United States, where the purchasing of all these so-called advanced weapon systems, whether we're talking aircraft carriers or jet fighters, the F-35, or tanks, it's all parceled out amongst congressional districts in order to bribe the members of Congress into buying onto these sometimes very redundant or useless weapon systems But because they own a piece of it, because they've got voters that are going to work in those corporations that are making some of this stuff, the entire defense industry is producing more to achieve political ends, whereas Russia does not, fortunately, face that danger. It is able to do it. What do we need in order to defend our country? What do we need in order to have a functional air defense system that's going to actually stop an incoming missile, as opposed to having to worry, well, are we going to piss off this senator or piss off that member of Congress if we go with Lockheed over General Dynamics? So I think the timing of this is both to ramp up production in Russia and to ramp it up in a way that it's going to be outside the political influence.
Yeah. Absolutely. And can I just say, I mean, all of this happened simultaneously with announcements of extensions of the Russian submarine program as well. So we're going to have more nuclear-powered submarines and that kind of thing. So, I mean, one can start to see the direction that things are going. I think this is an important reshuffle. It was, and it also suggests, by the way, a growing separation of the military part of the economy from the civilian, which continues to be run on a purely commercial market basis. So it's quite an interesting sort of set of decisions that have been made there.
Yeah, a final note from my own observation of this, of everything that we've discussed, and Shoigu coming to the Donbass and whatnot. This shows a regime that is supremely self-confident. They know that they're winning, and I think that that is the big takeaway of all these little moves that are happening all over. They feel, to use a Spanish expression, que tienen el sartén por el mango. They have the frying pan by the handle. They really know what they're doing, and that, on the one hand, that gives me confidence that this war will wind down as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, it highlights the fact that the Western leadership is so irrational. That is, for me, the eye-opening thing of the last 6 months: the irrationality and self-destructiveness of the European and American leadership. For me, it has been. I hate to use this word; it sounds just bizarre, but it's the truth. It has been traumatic, because I never thought that the Western leadership was this stupid. But I thought always that when they were doing something stupid, that maybe there was some reason, some hidden reason that I didn't understand. They're just fools. That's the thing. Yeah. Anyway, guys, any final thoughts before I wind it down and say goodbye to everybody?
Well, we live in extraordinarily interesting times. It's going to be a huge change. And can I just say, I still maintain that the United States will come through in some form. I mean, I still think it will come through. I still think it will remain one of the great powers. But Europe, I think we've done irreparable damage to ourselves. We are never going to restore this relationship with Russia that we had again. We could have built on it. We could have improved our economic and situation. We could have established peace in Europe, and we've thrown it away in the most reckless way. And I think also, and I have to say this too, I think we've involved the Americans in our quarrels, especially this complex that we have about Russia, to America's cost. And I hope that a wiser succession of American leaders will see that and will distance itself from us. And I think that will be good for the US, and in a paradoxical way, it might be good for us in Europe too, because we have this illusion always that we can use American power to achieve these objectives, and it's done us no good, and it's not done the Americans much good either.
I just say my only regret about today is that 4 of us, plus with Alex Cristoforo, we're not sitting around a table having this discussion over a good bottle of wine, maybe some bourbon and some cigars. That would have been superb, but this will do. This will do.
Yes. Yeah. And by the way, I posted and I highlighted on screen that, Alex Cristoforo couldn't make it because of his YouTube suspension. But as soon as that's over, I definitely want to have him on, because I love I love Alex. He's a great guy, and I owe him a great deal. So yeah, he will definitely be on. So anyway, that's been the roundtable for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.